The morning Emmett Ashford rode into the hollow with a legal writ in his saddlebag and repossession on his mind. He did not expect to find a woman hanging laundry off the side of the wagon he had come to claim, and he certainly did not expect that the sight of her would rearrange every quiet certainty he had built his life upon. The year was 1878, and the Kansas prairie stretched out in every direction like a bolt of sun-bleached canvas that God had unrolled and forgotten to hem. The grass was tall in places and brown in others, and the wind moved through it with the kind of restless persistence that made lesser men pack their things and go back east. Emmett was not a lesser man, but he was a tired one. He had been riding since before dawn out of the town of Caldwell, following directions scrawled on the back of an invoice that the bank manager, a slick-haired fellow named Gerald Prout, had pressed into his hand the previous evening along with $20 and a warning. "She is a stubborn one," Prout had said, clicking his tongue. "Widow woman. 3 months behind on the promissory note her late husband signed. The wagon is collateral. You go out there and you bring it back, Ashford, and I do not want to hear any story about how she cried or how the children were watching." Emmett had taken the money and the directions and had not said anything, because there was not much to say. He was a repo man, among other things. He had been a deputy once, and a cattle driver before that, and before that he had been the youngest son of a Virginia farmer who had come west at 22 with nothing but a horse and a stubborn belief that things could be better somewhere new. He was 31 now, and things were neither better nor worse, only different. He found the hollow just past a dry creek bed, where a single cottonwood had split itself in two and grown back together into a shape that looked almost like an arch. Beyond the arch of the cottonwood, the land dipped gently, and there was a wagon sitting in the bowl of the depression, angled slightly so that its tongue rested on the ground. Someone had unhitched it from any team and settled it in place as though it intended to stay. And it had stayed. That much was clear from 20 yards away. A canvas had been stretched from the rear of the wagon to a pair of wooden poles driven into the ground, creating a kind of lean-to awning over a small outdoor area where a fire ring had been built from stones. Tin pots hung from a simple iron hook mounted on the wagon's side rail. A rope had been strung between the wagon and the cottonwood, and from this rope hung 2 shirts, a long skirt, a pair of small trousers, and something that looked like a flour sack that had been cut and sewn into a child's dress. A woman stood at the rope with her back to him, pinning a damp cloth with wooden pegs, her dark hair loose around her shoulders because it was morning and she had not yet dressed it. She wore a faded blue work dress that was clean but worn at the elbows, and her boots were the kind that had been resoled at least once. She moved with the efficient, unsentimental economy of a person who had learned to get things done without much assistance. Emmett pulled his horse, a bay gelding named Patton, to a slow walk and then to a stop about 10 yards out. He cleared his throat. The woman did not flinch. She pinned the last corner of the cloth and turned around slowly, as if she had known he was there the whole time and had decided to finish her task before acknowledging him. Her eyes were brown and very direct, set in a face that was tanned from outdoor living, with a sharp jaw and a mouth that held a composure Emmett recognized as the kind that cost something to maintain. She looked at him steadily. She was young, he realized. Not a girl, but young. Maybe 26 or 27, with the kind of face that would look the same at 40 because the bones were good and the expression was clear. "You are from the bank," she said. It was not a question. Emmett touched the brim of his hat. "Emmett Ashford, ma'am. I have a writ from the Caldwell Savings and Lending regarding a wagon described as 1 Murphy freight wagon, model of 1874, with iron wheel rims and a green-painted body." He reached into his saddlebag and brought out the folded document. It was listed as collateral against a loan taken out by one Thomas Ramsey in the spring of 1877. "Thomas Ramsey is dead," the woman said. Her voice did not break on the words. She said them the way a person says a fact they have said many times and will have to go on saying. "I am sorry for that, ma'am, And he always was. It never seemed to help much. "Are you Mrs. Ramsey?" "Stella Ramsey," she said, and straightened her back slightly as she said it, as though the name itself were something she wore with intention. "Mrs. Ramsey, the outstanding balance on the note is $42.60 with 3 months of arrears. The bank has authorized me to recover the wagon in lieu of payment." Stella Ramsey looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at the wagon and then back at him, and there was something in her eyes that was not pleading and was not anger, but was something quieter and harder than either of those things. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "my children sleep in that wagon." He had not expected her to say that. He had expected tears or argument or a door slammed in his face. Pruitt had said she was stubborn, which usually meant difficult, which usually meant loud. This woman was not loud. "You are living in it," Emmett said, and he heard the change in his own voice even as he said it. The way the official tone had gone slightly uncertain at the edges. "Since March," she said simply. "Thomas died of pneumonia in February. We had been renting a room above the feed store in Caldwell, but I could not meet the rent and care for the children both. So I brought the wagon out here to my father-in-law's land. He passed last fall, God rest him, and the land has not been proved up yet, but no one is using it." Emmett looked at the camp around the wagon. He looked at the small trousers on the line, and the cut flour sack dress, and the careful arrangement of the stones in the fire ring, and the hooks on the side of the wagon from which the tin pots hung, and he understood that this woman had made, with considerable effort and ingenuity, something that functioned as a home. "How many children?" he asked. "2," she said. "Clem is 6 and Ada is 4. As if on cue, the canvas flap at the back of the wagon moved and a small face appeared, a boy with his mother's dark eyes and a smear of something that might have been porridge on his chin. He looked at Emmett with the frank, unguarded assessment of a child who has learned that strangers sometimes bring trouble. "That is Clem," Stella said. "Clem, go back inside a moment." "Is that a repo man?" Clem asked. Emmett felt something move in his chest that was not quite guilt but was its near neighbor. "Go back inside, Clem," Stella said again, gently this time, and the face disappeared. Emmett looked down at the writ in his hand. The paper was very official. Gerald Pruitt had signed it in a large, self-satisfied hand. The legal language was precise and allowed for no ambiguity. The wagon was to be recovered and brought to the Caldwell savings and lending by no later than the 15th of the month, which was 3 days away. He looked at Stella Ramsey, who was looking back at him with those steady brown eyes that were not asking him for anything, not begging, not manipulating, only watching to see what kind of man he was. "Where would you go," he said, "if I took it?" "I do not know," she said honestly. He folded the writ and put it back in his saddlebag. He did not say anything for a moment. The wind moved through the grass and the cottonwood made its papery sound, and somewhere out in the hollow a meadowlark called once and went quiet. "I am going to ride back to Caldwell," Emmett said slowly. "I need to speak with some people." Stella's expression did not change much, but something behind her eyes shifted slightly, like a lantern being turned up one notch. "Are you giving me notice?" she asked. "Because if you are, I would appreciate whatever time you can spare." "I am not giving you notice," Emmett said. He was not entirely sure what he was doing. He knew what he was not doing, which was taking the wagon. "I will be back in a day, maybe 2. Do you have enough food?" She blinked. That apparently was not what she had expected him to say. "We are managing," she said carefully. Emmett reached into his saddlebag again and brought out a paper sack he had been carrying since morning, containing 3 biscuits and a wedge of hard cheese that he had intended for his own lunch. He leaned down and held it out to her across the distance between them. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it and then at him, and he could see her weighing something in her mind, something to do with dignity and necessity, the particular arithmetic of pride that a person in a difficult situation must work out for themselves. Then she stepped forward and took the sack from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. She held the sack at her side and looked up at him. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," she said, and meant it. He touched his hat again and turned patent around and rode back the way he had come, and he did not look back until he was past the cottonwood arch, and when he did look back, she was still standing there watching him go, the paper sack in her hand, and the laundry swaying behind her in the prairie wind. He rode back to Caldwell thinking harder than he had thought in quite some time. The town of Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town with all the virtues and vices that designation implied. It sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail and smelled of cattle and dust, and the particular sharp yeast of the saloons that lined the main street. There was a bank, a general store, a blacksmith, 2 competing hotels, a livery, a barber shop, a church that was attended on Sundays with varying degrees of sincerity, and a population of permanent residents that numbered around 800, not counting the transient drovers who blew through with the cattle drives and spent their wages with an enthusiasm that kept the saloons profitable. Emmett did not go to the bank first. He went to the lumber yard. The yard was operated by a man named Augustus Briggs, who was 55 years old, built like a barrel stood on end, and possessed of an opinion on nearly every subject that he would share freely whether asked or not. He was also, behind the barrel-shaped exterior and the opinionated facade, one of the more decent men Emmett had encountered in Caldwell, and he owed Emmett a favor from 2 years prior that had involved a runaway horse and a narrow escape from considerable property damage. Emmett found Briggs in the yard stacking pine boards and told him what he had seen in the hollow. Briggs listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Emmett had finished, Briggs put down the board he was holding and scratched the back of his neck. "Thomas Ramsey," he said. "I remember him. Bought lumber from me last spring. Had plans to build a house on that quarter section. Decent fellow. Coughed a lot even then. His wife and 2 children are living in the repossessed wagon," Emmett said, "out in the open. The lean-to is not going to keep them warm come October, and October is 6 weeks away." Briggs squinted at him. "And you are telling me this because I need to know the cost of materials to build a small house," Emmett said. "1 room, solid, with a proper stove fitting." Briggs looked at him steadily for a moment. "You planning to build it yourself?" "With help," Emmett said, "if I can find any." Briggs turned and looked at his lumber yard for a moment, calculating. How small is small? "Enough for a woman and 2 children to live in with dignity," Emmett said. "Not a palace, just something real." Briggs picked up a board again and set it on the stack with a decisive thump. "I have some ends and shorts I cannot sell regular that I have been meaning to deal with. You take those, it cuts the cost down considerable. Studs, joists, some tongue and groove for the floor." He paused. "You asking me to donate or are you paying?" "I am paying what I can," Emmett said. "And I am asking you to consider what is right." Briggs snorted. "Do not get preachy at me, Ashford, I have enough of that on Sundays." But his voice did not have any real irritation in it. He set down his board again and went to get a pencil and a scrap of paper. While Briggs was calculating, Emmett went to the hardware store and bought a set of square nails and a new hammer, because his own hammer had a cracked handle he had been meaning to replace for a month. Then he went to the general store and bought enough provisions to last a woman and 2 children 3 weeks. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, a tin of lard, dried apples, and a paper of hard candy that he added on impulse and then felt slightly foolish about, but did not put back. He also, standing in the aisle of the general store, thought about Gerald Prout and the $42.60. Emmett had $41 saved. It was most of his savings. He had been keeping it toward nothing in particular, only the general principle that a man without savings was a man at the mercy of circumstances, and he had been at the mercy of circumstances enough times to know he did not like it. He stood in the general store aisle for a long minute, looking at a tin of peaches he did not need, and did a different kind of arithmetic. He bought the peaches. Then he went to the bank. Gerald Prout received him in the small, wood-paneled office at the back of the building, behind a desk that was slightly too large for the room and clearly intended to impress. Prout was a thin man with a neat mustache and the particular manner of a person who considers themselves to be performing a social service by lending money at interest to people who need it. "You have the wagon," Prout said, looking past Emmett as though expecting it to appear behind him. "I do not," Emmett said. Prout's eyes came back to his face. "I beg your pardon. The note was for $42.60 with arrears," Emmett said. He took his wallet from his coat pocket and counted out $42.60 onto Prout's desk. The bills were worn but real. "I am paying the outstanding balance. You will mark the note settled and release the wagon from the collateral agreement." Prout stared at the money on his desk and then at Emmett with the expression of a man encountering something he has not prepared for. "You cannot simply," he began. "The promissory note is a contract," Emmett said evenly. "The bank's remedy under the contract is the recovery of the collateral or the repayment of the debt. I am repaying the debt. You can choose not to accept it, but then you are refusing lawful tender, and I believe Judge Hartley, who is a personal acquaintance of mine, would find that interesting." Emmett did not actually know Judge Hartley particularly well, but he had helped the man's son locate a stolen horse the previous year, and the man had shaken his hand warmly at the time. He thought it was close enough. Prout looked at the money for another moment. Then he pulled a ledger toward him with the resigned dignity of a man accepting a situation he cannot change. "I will require a receipt," Emmett said. He left the bank with a receipt and $20 less than he had entered with, which, combined with the provisions, the nails, the hammer, and what he had promised to pay Briggs, left him with almost nothing. He stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the bank in the afternoon sun and considered this arithmetic and found he did not mind it as much as he thought he should. He went back to Briggs's yard. Briggs had a list and a pile of lumber set aside, more than Emmett had expected, including some decent wide pine boards that did not look like ends and shorts to him. "I may have underestimated what I had available," Briggs said, without looking at him. "That is very convenient," Emmett said. "I knew Thomas Ramsey," Briggs said, still not looking at him. "Helped him pick out the lumber last spring. He showed me a sketch he had drawn of the house he was going to build. Showed me where the window was going to go so his wife could see the prairie from the kitchen. He picked up a board and looked at it. She never got her window." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "She will get one now," he said. They arranged for the lumber to be loaded onto Briggs's delivery wagon the following morning. Briggs had a hired man named Woodrow who was strong and willing, and as Briggs put it, had nothing better to do than be useful. Emmett had also, between the bank and the lumber yard, stopped at the feed store and spoken to a man named Ike Dalton, who drove cattle and was between jobs and had known Thomas Ramsey from the trail. Ike said he would come and work for a day in Thomas's memory and would not hear of payment. That evening, in the small room he rented above the stable, Emmett Ashford sat on the edge of his cot and looked at the receipt from the bank and thought about a woman with brown eyes standing in a prairie hollow holding a paper sack of biscuits and cheese with the straight-backed composure of someone who had decided not to break. He had been in Caldwell 2 years. He had done his work and kept to himself and had not, in that time, done anything that felt particularly meaningful. He had been useful, in the way that a hammer is useful, employed for specific tasks by whoever needed one. He had been purposeful in a narrow way. He had not been a person who did things that rearranged his own interior landscape. He lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about Stella Ramsey and her 2 children in their wagon home, and the hooks she had made for the tin pots, and the rope she had strung to the cottonwood for the laundry, and the small flour sack dress. He told himself he was sleeping. He did not sleep for a long time. He was up before dawn, and by the time the sun was fully over the horizon he had patent loaded with the provisions and his tools, and Briggs's delivery wagon was loaded with lumber and being driven by Woodrow, who was a tall young man with red hair and an agreeably uncomplicated outlook on the world, and Ike Dalton was riding alongside on a spotted horse, wearing the same battered hat he had apparently worn for the last 10 years based on its condition. They made good time to the hollow. Stella heard them coming before they arrived. She was standing at the edge of the hollow when they came through the cottonwood arch, and the expression on her face when she saw the lumber wagon was something Emmett thought he would keep for a long time, somewhere private and internal where he kept things that mattered. She did not look relieved, exactly. She looked as though she was working very hard to understand something, and the understanding was arriving slowly, and it was altering the landscape of her face as it came. He rode up and stopped Patton in front of her and reached into his coat pocket and took out the receipt from the bank. "The note is settled," he said, holding it out to her. "The wagon is yours. I paid the arrears this afternoon. You will want to keep that paper in case anyone tries to claim different." She took the receipt from him. She read it again. Her fingers were careful on the paper as though it might dissolve. "You paid it," she said. "I did, out of your own money. I did." She looked up at him, and her expression was complicated in a way that he did not entirely know how to read yet, though he thought he might like to learn. "Why?" she said. It was a fair question. He thought about Prout and his large desk. He thought about the sketch of the house with the window. He thought about small trousers on a laundry line. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, which was true and also not entirely complete, but it was the best he could manage at the moment. She held his gaze for another second, and then she looked at the lumber wagon and at Woodrow on the seat and at Ike on his spotted horse, and at the tools and provisions loaded on Pat's back. "You brought lumber," she said. "I did. And men. 3 of us, counting me. Briggs said the lumber is enough for a one-room house, solid walls, proper roof, a floor. There is space on the southern wall for a window." Something moved across her face that was brief and bright, and then carefully composed itself back into steadiness. "A window," she said softly. "I am told windows are useful," Emmett said. For a moment the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was nearly a smile. It was brief, and it was gone before he could be entirely certain he had seen it, but he thought he had. "My children are still asleep," she said. "Can we get started before they wake, or will the noise—" "It will be noisy," Emmett said honestly. She nodded. "Then they will wake up, and I suppose that is all right." She paused. "I have coffee on the fire. Would you and your men like some?" Emmett looked back at Woodrow and Ike, who were both watching this exchange with a degree of interest they were not being particularly subtle about. "We would be grateful," he said. Stella Ramsey went to her fire and poured coffee into 4 tin cups and handed them around with the calm efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped worrying about whether the cups matched. They drank the coffee standing in the morning light while Emmett and Woodrow and Ike looked at the ground where they would build, and the day began. Building a house is loud, physical, exhausting work, and there is something about it that strips away pretense. You cannot be particularly formal with a person when you are both sweating over a wall plate at 10 in the morning. Emmett found this to be true of Ike and Woodrow, who were easy men to work alongside, steady and capable, the former occasionally breaking into song and the latter content with silence. He also found it, gradually and with some surprise, to be true of Stella. She did not stand back and watch. She helped. She had clearly done physical work before. She knew how to hold a board steady while a nail was set, and when Emmett said what he needed she understood and provided it without needing it explained twice. She brought water from the creek, which was dry at the bed but running clean just below the surface if you dug down 2 feet, as Emmett found out when he went looking. She cooked at midday without anyone asking her to, producing from her limited stores a meal of cornbread and salt pork beans that was better than anything Emmett had eaten in the past 2 weeks. Clem and Ada woke up to the sound of hammering and came tumbling out of the wagon in various states of undress to stand and stare at the activity with the wide-eyed attention of children watching something extraordinary. Ada, who was 4 and apparently had no fear of strangers whatsoever, walked directly up to Ike and asked him if he was a cowboy, and Ike said he reckoned he was, and Ada said she thought so because of the hat, and Ike laughed and let her try the hat on, which swallowed her entire head. Clem was more cautious. He watched Emmett for a long time from a distance of about 8 feet before he came any closer. Emmett was aware of being watched and went on working. After a while Clem said, "Are you still going to take the wagon?" "No," Emmett said. "The wagon belongs to your mother. I paid what was owed." Clem considered this. "Why?" "Because it was right." "Papa always said do right even when it costs you," Clem said. Emmett paused in his hammering. He looked at the boy who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's earnestness in them. "Your papa sounds like he was a smart man," Emmett said. "He was the smartest," Clem said with the absolute conviction of a 6-year-old. Then, "Can I hold the nails?" Emmett handed him the bag of nails. Clem took his job with tremendous seriousness and held the bag open and counted them under his breath, which Emmett found unexpectedly moving. The walls went up through the day. They were not fast, because there were only 3 men working, but they were steady. The ground in the hollow was solid enough to hold a foundation of flat stones that Emmett and Woodrow spent the first part of the morning collecting from the dry creek bed. The studs went up on the stone sill in the afternoon. The frame was square and plumb, and Emmett was particular about both because a crooked house is an unhappy house, and he had seen enough unhappy things. At one point, in the middle of the afternoon, Stella came to hold a board he was bracing and found herself standing close beside him, both of them leaning into the resistance of the green lumber that wanted to bow. He could smell wood smoke in her hair and the clean soap smell of someone who was careful about cleanliness even when circumstances made it difficult. She looked sideways at him, and he looked at the board he was nailing, and they did not say anything. But something was said, in the way things are sometimes said without words, in the air between two people who have been paying attention to each other all day without meaning to. By evening they had the frame up and the roof stringers in place, and it already looked like a house. It looked like a promise, Emmett thought, which was more than it had looked like that morning. Ike declared it good work and got on his horse and rode back to Caldwell, declining supper with thanks and the observation that his bunk was calling him. Woodrow stayed to eat and then hitched up the delivery wagon and followed. Emmett should have gone too. He knew he should have gone. He was tying Patton's reins to the cottonwood when Stella came and stood nearby. The sun was going down behind the prairie in sheets of orange and red, the kind of sunset that seemed designed to remind people that the world could be beautiful even when it was difficult. "You should stay," she said. "It is a long ride back to Caldwell in the dark, and the house is not finished." He looked at the frame of the house, open to the evening sky. "I can come back tomorrow." "You could sleep in the wagon tonight," she said. "The children and I can sleep under the lean-to. It is warm enough still." "I am not going to put you out of your own home," he said, which came out slightly awkward because it was not quite a home yet, still a wagon with a canvas lean-to. "It is not putting me out," she said. "It is being practical." A pause. "And it is what a person does when another person has done something large for them and has a 2-hour ride home in the dark." He tied Patton to the cottonwood. He stayed. That night he slept in the wagon on a fold of blanket that smelled of cedar and children, with the stars visible through the gap in the canvas, and listened to the prairie sounds, and thought about the particular strangeness of being in a place that felt less strange than it should. He woke to the sound of Ada singing something tuneless but enthusiastic about 3 feet from his ear, and Clem telling her to be quiet because the man was sleeping, and Stella's voice, lower and amused, saying she thought the man had probably heard worse. He got up and went to the fire. In the morning there was coffee and cornmeal porridge, and Emmett and Stella talked for the first time at length about practical things. The construction, the measurements for the window frame, whether the stove she had could be set on a proper stone hearth or whether they would need a new foundation for it. These were the words they used, but they were not only talking about those things. Emmett was aware of this, and he thought Stella was aware of it too. She had lived in Kansas 2 years, she told him. She had come from Missouri with Thomas when they were newly married. Thomas had believed in the land and in the future of the territory, and he had worked hard for it, but he had been consumptive, and the hard winters had shortened what might have been a longer story. He had been 28 when he died. She was 25 now. He was a good husband, she said, matter-of-factly. He was not perfect and I was not perfect and it was not easy, but it was good. Emmett did not ask more about Thomas. He thought she had said what she wanted to say about him, and he respected the economy of it. She asked about him and he told her the outlines. Virginia, the move west, the cattle driving years, the deputy work, the current work that he was increasingly less settled in. "Do you like it?" she asked. "The repossession work." He was quiet for a moment. "I am good at it," he said. "That is not the same thing." She smiled at that, a real smile this time, not the nearly smile from the day before. It transformed her face in a way that he found he needed to look away from briefly. Over the next 2 days, the house was built. Emmett came back the second day and the third, and Ike came for a half-day on the second day with a neighbor of his named Cord Whitaker who was a Texan, and had hands the size of iron skillets, and an efficient approach to carpentry that Emmett found useful. The walls were planked. The roof was shingled with cedar shakes that Briggs had included in the load, and the floor went in on the third afternoon with the tongue and groove boards that fit together with a satisfaction that Emmett felt physically. The window went in on the south wall. He built the frame carefully from leftover pine and glazed it with glass he had bought from the hardware store in Caldwell, a single pane, 12 by 18 inches. It let in a rectangle of southern light that fell across the floor and made the whole room seem intentional, settled, real. Stella stood in the doorway of the finished room and looked at the window and did not say anything for a moment. The light lay on the pine floor in a long parallelogram that shifted slightly as the sun moved. Ada stood at the window and looked out at the prairie and said, "I can see the grass," with such delight that Emmett felt something loosen in his chest. "Thomas drew you this window," Emmett said quietly, standing beside Stella. He had not planned to say it, it came out because it was true. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something in the same family. "Briggs told you," she said. "He did." She was quiet. "Thomas was a planner," she said softly. "He made plans for everything. He always said the window had to face south because I liked the light." She paused. "I did not know he had told anyone." "He was proud of you," Emmett said. "That was the impression Briggs had. A man who wanted to build something worthy of the woman waiting for it." She looked at the window for a long time. Then she looked at Emmett, and there was a depth in that look that he felt rather than interpreted. "Thank you," she said, and meant it the way she had meant it the first time on the first morning when she had taken the paper sack of biscuits from his hand. But there was more in it now. There was a whole 3 days of more in it. The stove went in that afternoon, mounted on a stone hearth that Emmett built from the creek stones. He set the stovepipe through the roof with a tin collar against the rain. By evening the stove was lit and giving off a warm, even heat that was the best thing about autumn indoors, and Stella was cooking on it with the kind of quiet pleasure that a person takes in a thing they had given up hoping for. They ate supper inside the house, all of them, Emmett and Stella and Clem and Ada, crowded around the small table Emmett had built from leftover boards, a rough thing but level and steady, and Ada kept touching the wall as if confirming it was real. Emmett thought it was the finest meal he had eaten in years, though it was only beans and biscuits and dried apple sauce from the provisions he had brought. He thought it was the company, but he did not say that. After supper, Clem fell asleep at the table and had to be carried to his bedroll, which he accepted without fully waking. Ada lasted slightly longer and demanded a story before bed, which Stella provided in a quiet voice while sitting on the edge of the bedroll in the lamplight. A story about a rabbit who built a house in a hollow and found that it was the best house in the whole prairie. Emmett stood in the doorway of the house and listened to the story and felt the warm air from the stove against his back and looked out at the dark prairie and thought about things. When the children were asleep, Stella came and stood in the doorway beside him. It was a narrow doorway and they were standing close in it, both looking out at the dark. "You cannot keep sleeping in the wagon," she said. "You have done enough. You should go back to Caldwell tomorrow." "I know," he said. "But you should come back," she said, and her voice was careful and direct in the way her eyes were, and she was looking out at the dark prairie, not at him, which he thought was because she was saying something that required some courage to say. He looked at the side of her face. The lamplight was behind them, and it found the line of her jaw and her cheekbone, and the way her hair was pinned back for the night, a few dark strands escaping. "I will come back," he said. She nodded slightly as though filing that away. "I need to think about what comes next," she said. "There is the land. I do not know if I can prove it up. Thomas started the process, but he had not filed the claim properly. I have the papers, but I do not know the law well enough to know what they mean." "I know something about land claims," Emmett said. "Not everything, but something. I can look at the papers." She turned then and looked at him, and in the lamplight he saw something in her face that was careful and also warm, the careful warmth of someone who had not been warm at random for a while and was choosing to be warm deliberately. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked, which was the same question she had asked the first morning, but it was not the same question. It had more in it now. He looked at her and thought about how to answer honestly. "Because I was going to take away your home," he said, "and instead I find that I want to help you build one, and I find that I want to keep coming back to see how it is standing." He paused. "And I find that those things are connected to you specifically and not just to the general situation, and I think you understand what I mean by that." She was very still for a moment. The wind moved the grass outside, and the lamp in the house behind them gave its steady, quiet light. "I understand," she said. "I think I felt it the first morning. I thought you were a decent man, and then I thought you were a remarkable one, and then I told myself not to be foolish about it because I have 2 children and a plot of land I am not certain I own and a wagon for a house." "Not anymore," Emmett said. "On the wagon front." "No," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved the way it had that first morning. "Not anymore." They stood in the doorway a little longer, and the dark prairie was wide and quiet around them. "Come back," she said finally. "I mean that." "I know you do," he said. "I will." He rode back to Caldwell in the dark, which was not so dark because the moon was up, and the stars were very bright over the Kansas plain, and Patton knew the road well enough to manage without much guidance. Emmett rode with his hands loose on the reins, and his thoughts in the warm interior of a small house in a hollow, with a south-facing window and a stone hearth, and a woman standing in the lamplight doorway saying words that he was going to be thinking about for a long time. He went back 3 days later, and then 4 days after that, and then again the following week. And by the 3rd visit he had stopped telling himself there was a practical reason, because the practical matters were largely sorted. He came because Stella was there, and because Clem had started saving him the good seat by the fire, and because Ada always ran to meet him when she heard Patton's hooves on the dry grass, and because Stella would look up when he came through the door and her face would do that careful, warm thing, and he thought he could happily spend his life trying to earn that look. On his 4th visit, he brought the land papers with him and sat at the small table with Stella and went through them in the lamplight. It took 2 hours and considerable squinting at the territorial homestead law language, but by the end of it, they had established that Thomas had in fact made a valid preliminary filing under the Homestead Act, which meant that Stella, as his widow, could carry the claim forward. She needed to complete 5 years of continuous residence and make certain improvements to the land to prove up. "The house counts as improvement," Emmett said, running his finger down the relevant paragraph. "More than counts. And you have been here since March, which is 7 months. You need 4 years and 5 months more." 4 years and 5 months, Stella repeated, looking at the paper. "That is a long time." "It is," he said, "but at the end of it you own the land outright, 160 acres. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that he had not expected. "Thomas always said the land was for us, for the family. He said he wanted to give us something that could not be taken away." She looked at the papers. "He gave it to us even from where he is now, it seems." Emmett looked at her profile in the lamplight and thought about what it meant to give a person something that could not be taken away. "You could do more with the land," he said. "Raise a few cattle, maybe. Chickens certainly, a kitchen garden, with a good water source. There is a spring, she said. Up the ridge about 300 yards. Thomas found it. He said it was sweet water. He looked at her. You never mentioned a spring. You never asked about a spring, she said, and there was the edge of a smile in her voice. He laughed, which surprised him a little, because he was not in the habit of laughing and had not expected it to arrive that easily. She laughed too, briefly and bright, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was the best sound he had heard on the Kansas prairie in 2 years. After the laughter there was a silence that was different from the silences before it, quieter and more settled, like a room after a window has been opened and the air inside matches the air outside. Emmett, she said. She used his given name for the first time, which they both noticed. Stella, he said. When you come back next time, she said, I would like you to stay more than an afternoon. He looked at her. How long? As long as is decent, she said, with a composure that he now understood was a form of courage. And perhaps we can talk about what things are going to look like, what you want, what I want, whether they are the same thing. I think they might be the same thing, he said. I think so too, she said, but I have 2 children who are part of that thing and they need to be considered. I know, he said. I want to consider them. I have been considering them. She looked at him steadily. You are not frightened off by that? No, he said, I am not. She nodded once, and then turned back to the land papers and began rolling them carefully to put away. And the subject was set aside as a thing agreed upon rather than a thing resolved, which was its own kind of resolution. Over the weeks that followed, the hollow changed. Emmett came back the following weekend with a coop kit he had built in Caldwell from spare boards, and brought 6 laying hens and a cockerel in a crate on the back of Patton, which Patton had objected to loudly, and Emmett had handled with patience. The chickens were installed in the coop, and Ada declared them her personal responsibility, which she took seriously enough that the egg production was supervised on a twice-daily basis. He came back the weekend after with materials for a proper privy, which was less romantic but entirely necessary, and which he and Clem built together, Clem proving himself a useful 6-year-old with a real talent for holding things level. He came back again and they dug out the spring together, he and Stella, shoring the sides with rocks to make a proper well collar, and when the clean cold water came up sweet and steady, Stella sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Thomas was right, she said. It is sweet water. It is the best water I have tasted in Kansas, Emmett said, and he was not being poetic, he was being literal. She looked at him with the spring between them and the late October light on the ridge and said, I want to tell you something. Tell me, he said. I was afraid of you when you first came, she said. Not afraid of you exactly, afraid of what you represented. I had been afraid of so many things for so long. Thomas dying and the rent and the cold coming and where we would go. And then you came and you were going to be one more thing to be afraid of. She paused. And then you turned around and went away and came back with lumber and food and men to help build. And I thought, well, that is not what I was expecting. No, he said. And now I find that when you are not here, I am aware of you not being here, she said. And I would like to talk about what to do about that. He was sitting on the grass beside the spring with his boots wet from the digging, and he looked at her across the new-cleared water and thought that he had ridden a lot of miles in his life, and some of them had felt purposeless and some had felt directed, but none of them had felt as pointed and correct as the one that had brought him through the Cottonwood Arch in October. Stella, he said. Emmett, she said. I think, he said carefully, that I would like to be here, not as a man who comes on weekends. As a man who is here. If that is something you would consider. She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved in the grass on the ridge above them. The sun was warm on the back of his neck. I think I would consider it, she said. I think I have been considering it for several weeks. He stood up from the grass and she stood too, and he was close to her and she did not step back. He looked at her, the line of her jaw and her careful eyes and the composure that he now understood was not distance but depth. He reached out and took her hand, which was calloused from work and strong and warm. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him. He kissed her then, standing by the spring on the ridge in the October sun, and she kissed him back with the same direct and deliberate quality that characterized everything she did, not tentative, not desperate, but certain, the way she did everything that mattered. When they stepped apart, the spring was still running clean and the light was still good and the grass was moving in the wind. "That was not indecent, I hope," he said. "I started it," she said, which was not entirely accurate in terms of the sequence of events, but which he found he was entirely content to agree with. They walked back down to the house together, and he helped her with the supper, and Clem told them both at length about a hawk he had seen catching a mouse in the grass, with detailed and enthusiastic mime of the hawk's trajectory, and Ada ate her supper wearing his hat again, which she had developed a habit of borrowing. That night he slept in the lean-to, which was still standing as a storage space, on a bedroll he had started keeping there, and he looked at the stars over the Kansas plain and felt the particular contentment of a man who knows where he wants to be. He spoke to Stella about the practical matters over the next visit and the one after. He had savings, what was left of them, which was not much, but his skills were worth money and there was work in Caldwell and the surrounding area for a man who could build and repair things, a carpenter's trade being something he had taught himself over the course of several years, by the simple method of doing it until he was good at it. He could let go of the repossession work, which had never suited him, and work as a carpenter and general hand. It was honest labor that built things rather than taking them. Stella listened to all of this and then said, "You have thought about this carefully." "I have thought about it a great deal," he said. "And the land," she said. "You know that if this were to," she paused, choosing words. "You know that the homestead claim runs through me because of how Thomas filed it." "I know," he said. "That is fine, it should be yours. But if we were married," she said, and the word sat in the air between them with a specific weight, "it would be ours." "Yes," he said. She looked at the south-facing window and the light on the pine floor. "I was 23 when I married Thomas," she said. "I had never lived anywhere that was mine. We were always renting, always owing. The land is the first thing I have ever had that was truly mine or could be." She paused. "I am not saying that to be difficult." "I know you are not," he said. "I am saying that I need you to understand that I would be bringing something to this. Not just 2 children and a quarter section of Kansas grass." She looked at him. "I need you to understand that I am not someone you are rescuing. I am someone you are meeting." He looked at her, and he felt the truth of what she was saying settle into him and find its right place there. "Stella," he said, "I understand that. I understood it the first morning when you turned around and looked at me and did not flinch. You are not a woman who needs rescuing. You are a woman who was in a difficult situation because of circumstances that were not of your making, and you were managing it with more capability than most people I have ever known." He paused. "I am not here because I want to save you. I am here because I want to be near you. Because you are the most compelling person I have encountered in my adult life, and because I think about what you said and think about your face and think about your children and think about this hollow, and it feels like home to me, which is a thing I have not felt since I left Virginia at 22. She looked at him for a long moment, and her careful brown eyes were bright again. "That is a very good answer," she said. "I meant every word of it," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That is why it is good." November came to the Kansas plain with its gray skies and cold winds, and the cottonwood in the hollow dropped its leaves all at once in a single gusty afternoon, and the hollow looked different without them, more open and colder, but also more honest. The small house stood solid against the November sky, its stone chimney letting out a steady thread of smoke from the stove within. Emmett had moved his things to the hollow. He slept in the lean-to, which had been properly winterized with additional planking on 2 sides, and this arrangement was agreed upon between himself and Stella as appropriate until such time as things were formalized, which was her word, and he respected it. They were both practical people and both principled ones, and the situation was understood for what it was, a clear intention that was taking the time it deserved. He had told Gerald Prout he was done with the repossession work, an interview that had given him more pleasure than he thought it should. Prout had looked at him with the expression of a man who suspects he is being judged and does not enjoy it, and Emmett had left the bank for the last time with the feeling of someone setting down a tool that has always been slightly wrong for the hand. His carpentry work began in earnest, and he found it was more than enough to meet their needs. There were houses being built all across the territory, and a man who was reliable and careful and delivered what he said he would deliver was worth something. He took jobs in Caldwell and the surrounding area, coming home to the Hollow in the evenings with sawdust in his hair and the particular fatigue of a day's good physical work. Coming home. He had begun to think of it in those terms without deciding to. One evening in mid-November he came back from a 3-day job in the town of Sumner and found the Hollow dark and the stove cold, and his first feeling was alarm, quickly replaced by reason, quickly replaced by the understanding that he had developed, without acknowledging it, something that felt very much like the anxiety of a man who has something to lose. He found them at the Dalton place, half a mile east, where Ike Dalton had a small ranch and a wife named Clara who was apparently Stella's nearest neighbor and had become, over the past several weeks, a friend. Clara Dalton was a frank and generous woman with a loud laugh and a talent for corn pudding, and she had taken a decided interest in the situation in the Hollow, which she communicated by feeding Emmett enormous meals whenever he came to the Dalton place, and looking at him and Stella with an expression of satisfied matchmaking. Stella had been there because Ada had caught a cold and Clara had come by in the afternoon with a broth she swore by for sick children, and had taken the whole party back to her own kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who knows exactly what help looks like and does not wait to be asked. Ada was bundled by the Dalton fire with a cloth on her chest, looking pink-nosed and aggrieved. Clem was playing some kind of game with Ike Dalton's youngest, a boy named Pete, that appeared to involve a great deal of running. Stella was at the table with Clara drinking coffee and talking in the low, rapid way of two women who have found each other's company after a spell of isolation. She looked up when he came in, and the warmth that came into her face when she saw him was no longer careful. It was simply warm, the straight-line version of it, and it hit him somewhere in the region of his sternum. "You are back," she said. "How is Ada?" He said, going first to the small girl by the fire, who held up her arms to him with the imperious confidence of a sick child accustomed to comfort. He picked her up, and she settled against his shoulder and put her hot forehead against his neck, and he stood there holding her while Stella told him about the cold and Clara said it was nothing to worry about, just the autumn chill catching the little ones. He was aware, across the room, of Clara Dalton catching Stella's eye and doing something emphatic with her eyebrows, and of Stella making a small suppressive gesture that might have meant keep your observations to yourself, Clara, and of Clara completely ignoring this suggestion. He thought he liked Clara Dalton very much. When they walked back to the Hollow that evening, Ada carried in his arms and Clem walking seriously beside them with a lantern, Stella and Emmett were quiet in a comfortable way. "You were worried," she said after a while. "When I found the house dark and cold," he said. "Yes," she glanced at him. "We were only at the Daltons." "I know that now," he said. "In the moment I was, yes, worried." She was quiet for a step or two. "I am glad," she said simply, which was perhaps the most Stella thing she had ever said, and he thought he loved her for it. They were at the door of the house when he said, "I want to ask you something." She opened the door and he carried Ada to her bedroll and put her down gently, and she went back to sleep immediately with the abandonment of a child. Clem put the lantern on the table and went to his own bedroll without being asked, and was asleep in minutes. Emmett stood in the middle of the room and Stella stood near the stove, feeding it from the wood box, and the fire grew behind the iron door and the room began to warm. "Ask me," she said. He took a breath. He was not a man who was practiced at this. He was a man who was practiced at direct speech, which was almost the same thing. "Stella Ramsey," he said, "I want to marry you. I want to live here in this hollow with you and Clem and Ada, and build things and grow things and prove up this land, and be the kind of man that your children can rely on, and that you can rely on, and that, 30 years from now, you will still want to be talking to at the end of the day. I do not have much in the way of material goods at the moment, and I know I am asking you to take a person who is largely starting over, and I know that is an imperfect proposal in some respects." He paused. "But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am certain that I want to be your husband, if you will have me." The stove fire caught with a small rush of sound. The lamplight was steady. Outside, the November wind moved over the Kansas plain and through the empty cottonwood. Stella looked at him across the room with her careful, steady eyes. She was still for a moment. Then she set the firewood in her hands carefully on the pile and walked to him and stood in front of him with a foot of air between them. "I will have you, Emmett Ashford," she said. He kissed her in the warm light of the new house, his hands on her face, and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back the way she did everything that mattered, with certainty and intention and a warmth that was not performed and not cautious, and not anything other than entirely real. Behind them, from the darkness of the bedroll corner, a small voice said, "Are you getting married?" Neither of them had heard Clem wake up. Emmett pulled back and looked at the boy, who was lying on his side with his eyes half open and a very alert expression for someone who was supposedly asleep. "If your mother will have me," Emmett said. "She just said she would." Clem was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said, "Good," and closed his eyes and went back to sleep, with the decisive economy of a 6-year-old who has received a satisfactory answer. Stella turned her face into Emmett's shoulder, and he felt her laughing silently, her whole body shaking with it, and he put his arms around her and held on. They were married in January of 1879, at the church in Caldwell, on a cold, bright day that glazed the snow on the plain to a hard white crust that threw back the winter sun until everything sparkled. Clara Dalton was the witness. In a good dress she had ironed twice by her own report, and Ike Dalton was the other, in the same hat he always wore but with his shirt tucked in, which was evidently his formal variation. Clem wore a new pair of trousers that Emmett had bought him, and Ada wore a blue dress that Clara had sewn from cloth Stella had been saving for an occasion. The dress had a white collar, and Ada considered it the finest garment in existence. The minister was a thin man named Reverend Hollies, who asked them their names and their intentions in a serious voice, and nodded when they gave their vows with the focus of two people who mean what they say. When it was done and they were outside in the cold, bright air, Stella in her good dress with her dark hair up in her breath making small clouds in the January cold, and Emmett beside her with his best coat on and his hat in his hand, Clem said in a carrying voice, "Now Emmett is our papa." Emmett looked at Stella and Stella looked at him, and in the look was something that had no word adequate to it, some combination of gratitude and joy and seriousness that two people share when they understand the weight of what they have just done and are glad of it. He crouched down to Clem's level. "If you want to call me that," he said. Clem considered. "I will think about it," he said, with the diplomatic gravity of a 6-year-old who has his own processes. Then he took Emmett's hand, which was an answer of a different kind. Ada did not deliberate. She walked over and put both arms around his neck and said "Papa" into his ear with complete conviction, and that was that. The winter was hard in the way Kansas winters were hard, but the house held against it. The stove was good, and the walls were solid, and the insulating layer of straw that Emmett had stuffed between the outer and inner boards kept the temperature livable on the coldest nights. They were not comfortable in the way of people with money, but they were warm and they were together, and Emmett found that these two things, which he had not had simultaneously in his adult life, produced a quality of contentment that was entirely different from happiness, being less acute and more sustaining. He worked, and Stella worked, and between them they managed the quarter section with increasing competence. The chickens produced through the winter with only moderate sulking. The spring water ran clean through the cold months and kept them from the hardship of hauling water from the creek. The kitchen garden Stella had planted in the fall had produced enough dried goods to carry them through, and Emmett's carpentry work continued to bring in enough cash for provisions and the few necessities that the land could not supply. He bought a milk cow in February from a farmer outside Caldwell who was selling up. The cow was a steady-tempered brown animal that Clem named General without any particular reason, and that Ada tried to braid the tail of once, under the apparent impression that it would be appreciated. The cow had a different opinion on this, but the incident was resolved without significant casualties. In the spring, Emmett broke ground on an expansion to the house. He had been planning it through the winter, in his head and then on paper, a two-room addition that would give the children their own space and give himself and Stella a proper bedroom rather than the curtained-off corner of the main room. It was a larger project than the original house, and he had the skills and the lumber and the time between carpentry jobs to do it right. Briggs came out in April to see the original house and pronounced it the best small build he had seen in the territory, which from Briggs was high praise, given that he expressed most compliments as if they were reluctant confessions. "I may have one or two more pieces of lumber I cannot seem to sell," Briggs said, looking at the stack Emmett had behind the house for the addition. "Augustus," Emmett said. "Do not get sentimental about it," Briggs said, and drove his wagon back to Caldwell before Emmett could thank him properly. The addition went up through April and May. Clem worked alongside Emmett with increasing usefulness, having developed over the past several months the focused attention of a boy who is learning a craft and knows it. He was 7 now and small for his age, but his hands were steady and his eye was good, and Emmett taught him everything he knew about measuring twice and cutting once, and about the satisfaction of a joint that fits true. "This is what you do," Clem said one afternoon, holding a board while Emmett checked the level. "Not a question." "It is," Emmett said. "Build things," Clem said. "When I am lucky," Emmett said. "Some of what I get paid for is fixing things, but building is better." Clem was quiet while Emmett nailed. Then, "I think I want to do it too." Emmett looked at him. "You have time to decide that." "I know," Clem said, "but I think I do." Emmett felt something move through him that was not merely warmth but was something more specific and private, the feeling of being the person a child chooses to follow, which is a weight and an honor simultaneously. "Then I will teach you," he said. Stella saw this exchange from the door of the house, where she had come to call them for supper. She did not say anything. She just watched with that full, quiet look that Emmett had learned to read by now as her containing something large. Later, when the children were in bed and the evening was theirs, she told him, "You are a good father, Emmett." He was sitting at the table with the lamp and a piece of paper he had been using to plan the window placement for the addition, and he looked up at her. "I am learning," he said. "You learned fast," she said, and sat down across from him with her mending, and they were quiet together in the good way, the way that requires no management. By June of 1879, the addition was complete. The house was now 3 rooms: the original main room with the south-facing window and the stove, a sleeping room for Clem and Ada with a proper door and a small east window that let in the morning light, and a bedroom for Emmett and Stella with a window on the west that showed the prairie sunsets in strips of red and orange each evening. It was a solid house. Not grand, not fashionable, not the kind of thing that anyone would remark on in passing. But it was a house that had been built with care and intention, and with the specific knowledge of who would live in it, and it held that intention in its walls. Stella stood in the doorway of their bedroom looking at the sunset through the west window, and Emmett stood behind her with his arms around her and his chin at her temple, and the light came through the glass in long orange strips across the new pine floor. "It is a good house," she said. "It is," he said. "You built it," she said. "We built it," he said. "You held enough boards." She laughed and turned in his arms to face him, and in her face was everything: the warmth and the composure and the directness, and the something underneath all of it that was his, that she had given specifically to him over the course of a year of mornings and evenings and difficult days and simple good ones. "I love you, Emmett Ashford," she said. He looked at her in the sunset light in the house they had built, and thought about the morning he had ridden through the cottonwood arch with a writ in his saddlebag and found her hanging laundry on a rope. "I love you, Stella Ashford," he said. She smiled at her new name, and he kissed her, and the prairie sun went on going down in its extravagant way over the Kansas plain. The summer of 1879 was warm, and the kitchen garden flourished under Stella's management in a way that surprised even her. She had a gift for growing things that she attributed to her mother, and Emmett attributed to her general tenacity, and the result was a garden that produced tomatoes, beans, squash, turnips, onions, and a sprawling tangle of cucumber vines that Ada used as a personal jungle. They put up vegetables through August and September with Clara Dalton's help, the two women working in Stella's kitchen with the windows open and the smell of vinegar and hot glass in the air, talking and laughing with the ease of women who have become essential to each other. Emmett took a larger carpentry contract in August, helping to build a hotel in a growing town 30 miles west, which kept him away 3 weeks and made him understand fully what he had been told about the difference between moving through the world alone and moving through it with a home to return to. He wrote Stella a letter from the job, which was not something he had ever done before, and she wrote him back, and the letters were practical and affectionate, and said between their lines the things that long letters between people who love each other always say. He came home to the Hollow on a Friday evening in late August with his pay and a length of green calico he had seen in a dry goods store and bought on impulse because it was the color of the cottonwood leaves in early spring. Stella held the fabric up in the lamplight and looked at him with an expression that was warm and slightly exasperated. "You cannot keep buying me things," she said. "I had $35 profit from the job," he said. $1.50 went to the calico. "I think the arithmetic allows for it." "It is very pretty," Ada said, from the vicinity of Emmett's left knee, where she had attached herself upon his arrival and had not yet let go. "It is," Stella said, and folded it carefully. "I will make Ada a dress and myself something sensible." He put his arm around her. "Make yourself something pretty," he said into her hair. She made them both something pretty. He liked the dress she made for herself particularly, the green against her dark hair and brown eyes, and told her so in terms that were direct enough that she went slightly pink and looked at him with an expression that combined pleasure and demureness in a way he found entirely captivating. In September, Stella told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, when the children were outside and the house was quiet, standing by the south-facing window with her hands at her sides and her eyes on him directly in the way she had of delivering important information, straight and clear, and watching to see how it landed. It landed like sunlight, like the feeling of clean water from the spring, like coming through the cottonwood arch and seeing the smoke from the stove chimney. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, and she was looking at him with something bright and a little uncertain, still the careful warmth, still the watchful measurement, even now, because she was who she was and he loved her for being exactly who she was. "Stella," he said. "I know it is soon," she said. "It is wonderful," he said. "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "I have done this before. I know what to expect." "I do not," he said, which was true. He had no experience of this particular road, and the realization of that, standing with his hands on his wife's face in the lamplight of their house, was both humbling and profound. "I will tell you what to do," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "You usually do," he said. She laughed and leaned her forehead against his and closed her eyes, and he held her there in the morning quiet of their house while the prairie wind moved outside and the cottonwood stood in its arch, and the chickens carried on their commentary in the yard. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was the hardest one Kansas had seen in several years. The blizzards came early and stayed long, and the temperature dropped to levels that cracked water barrels and tested the quality of every wall and window and chimney in the territory. The hollow, being below the ridge line, had some natural shelter from the worst of the wind, and Emmett's walls held, every one of them, through every storm, which was a satisfaction he did not speak about but felt quietly and continuously. He spent the worst days inside with Stella and Clem and Ada, and found that being snowbound in a house full of family was a different experience from being snowbound alone, which he had been in previous winters, in drafty rented rooms in various cattle towns, with nothing but a candle and his own restlessness. There was something about the constancy of being needed that anchored a man in a way he had not expected. He told stories in the evenings by the stove, stories from his cattle driving years and his time as a deputy, stories edited for the younger audience but still containing enough adventure to hold Clem wrapped and Ada half asleep in his lap. Stella listened too, from her chair by the lamp with her mending or her knitting, and he could see her listening even when she appeared to be focused on her work, the small adjustments of her expression that followed the narratives, and he thought he would tell her all the stories eventually, even the ones that were not suited for children. She told him stories, too, of Missouri and her girlhood, of a mother who had been formidable and a father who had been gentle, of coming west with Thomas and the first years of it, the years that had been hard but also full of the particular excitement of building a life from open ground. He listened to everything she told him and kept it, the way he kept the other things that mattered. On the 3rd of March, 1880, in the last weeks of the hard winter, their son was born. Clara Dalton was there, because Clara Dalton was not a woman who left a friend to manage these things alone, and she was efficient and calm, and had apparently brought more children into the world than Stella had known about, having served as an informal midwife on the frontier for several years. Emmett was consigned to the main room with the children, where he experienced the particular helplessness of the situation, with a level of anxiety that Clem regarded with interest and Ada found reassuring to pat on the arm about. When Clara came to the door and told him it was done and all was well, he felt his legs go slightly unsteady in a way they had not done in circumstances that had involved actual horses and actual firearms. He went in. Stella was propped against the pillow with their son in her arms, and the exhaustion on her face was the bright and particular kind that Emmett recognized as the exhaustion of having done something enormous, and having done it. The baby was small and red and astonishingly present in the way all new people are astonishingly present, already fully himself in some undefinable way. She looked up at Emmett, and the warmth in her face was very simple and very full. "Come and meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time, and the world was very large and very quiet simultaneously. "Thomas James," Stella said, "if you agree, for his father and for yours." Emmett's father had been James. He looked up at her. "You remembered I told you that," he said. "I remember everything you tell me," she said. He looked down at Thomas James Ashford, who was looking at the world with the scrunched focus of a person just arrived in it. "Thomas James," he said. "Yes." From the main room, there was the sound of Ada asking very rapidly, and at some volume, whether the baby was here yet, and Clara's voice telling her to give her mother a moment, and Clem's voice telling Ada not to be so loud, and Ada telling Clem she was not loud, and all of it warm and ordinary and overwhelming. Emmett looked at Stella, and Stella looked at him, and outside the last of the winter's snow was melting off the roof in steady drips that hit the ground with a soft percussion, and the cottonwood was bare but standing, and the spring on the ridge was running and clean, and the house was solid around them in every wall and beam and joint. "You are remarkable," he said. "We both are," she said, which was her way, direct and equal and entirely right. The years moved forward with the honest momentum of a life being well lived. The spring of 1880 brought the thaw and the new planting in Thomas James's first full-throated screaming exploration of the world, which Emmett navigated with the combination of terror and competence that characterized new fatherhood, and which Stella guided him through with a patience that was part amusement and entirely love. Clem, who had been the man of the family in his own estimation for a considerable time, took to the baby with proprietary seriousness. Ada took to the baby with the conviction that he was a doll of extraordinary quality and had to be gently dissuaded from certain demonstrations of affection until Thomas James was old enough to defend himself. The homestead grew. Emmett built a proper barn in the summer of 1880, with help from Ike Dalton and 2 other neighbors who had come to know the household in the hollow, a loose and practical community of frontier people who understood that everyone's work was better when it was shared. The barn was good enough for the milk cow and a second cow they acquired that fall, and for the 2 horses that replaced Pat, who had gone lame that spring and been retired to graze on the sweet grass above the spring, which he appeared to consider an entirely satisfactory arrangement. Stella ran the house with the same efficient intelligence she brought to everything, but it was no longer merely management, it was creation. The kitchen garden became a proper kitchen garden, with a fence to discourage the general successor, a cow with less patience for personal boundaries. The root cellar Emmett dug in the fall of 1880 kept enough vegetables and preserves to carry them through 2 winters without the anxiety of running short. She began selling eggs in Caldwell when the laying hens reached a number that exceeded their own consumption, and the money from the eggs went into a tin box that she called the glass fund, because she wanted proper glass windows in the barn, which Emmett found both practical and characteristic of her. In the winter of 1882, Emmett was offered a partnership by Augustus Briggs, who was finding the lumberyard increasingly more than one man could manage, and who had come, with his characteristic grumbling reluctance, to admit that Emmett was the person he most trusted with it. The arrangement was straightforward. Emmett would manage the yard and take half the profit on days he worked there, maintaining his own independent carpentry work for the rest of the time. It was a good offer and he took it, and found that having the yard behind him changed the scale of what he could offer clients, which expanded the work and the income in ways that mattered. The homestead clock ran forward. The 5 years of continuous residence required for proving up arrived in October of 1882, and Emmett and Stella rode to Caldwell together on a clear fall morning to file the final claim. The land agent was a new man since the filing days, a young fellow from Ohio who looked at the papers with bureaucratic thoroughness and found them entirely in order, which they were, because Emmett had been through them a dozen times and Stella had been through them a dozen more. They walked out of the land agent's office onto the main street of Caldwell, with the deed to 160 acres of Kansas prairie in Stella's hand, and Stella held it for a moment in the October sunlight, looking at it. "It is ours," she said. "It is," he said. She looked at him. The sunlight was good on her face. She was 29 years old and she was exactly herself, the sharp jaw and the steady brown eyes and the composure that was depth and not distance, and behind it for him the full warmth that was not cautious and had not been cautious for several years now. "Thomas would be glad," she said. "He wanted this." "He got it," Emmett said. "He just needed some help." She folded the deed carefully and put it in her coat pocket and took his hand, and they walked back to where their horses were tied and went home. Their second child together arrived in the spring of 1883, a girl they named Louise Clara, the second name for Clara Dalton, who cried at the announcement with the loud and unashamed sincerity that was her most endearing quality. Louise was a round and amiable baby who slept without protest and smiled at everything, a temperament that Clem declared was very pleasant after the more operatic personality of Thomas James at the same age. Ada, who was 9 and had developed strong opinions about everything, determined that Louise was the most beautiful creature alive, and became her devoted shadow for the next several years. The hollow in 1883 was not the bare depression with a wagon in it that Emmett had ridden into 5 years earlier. The house was solid and expanded. 3 rooms become 4 with the birth of Louise. A sleeping porch added off the back that Clem and Thomas James shared through the warmer months. The barn was painted red because Stella had wanted red, and there was no reason not to give her red. The kitchen garden was enclosed in a proper fence. The cottonwood arch at the entrance to the hollow had been kept clear of undergrowth and stood as it had stood, split and grown back together into a form that was almost intentional, a threshold, an entrance. Emmett planted a row of apple trees along the south side of the house in the spring of 1883, young trees from a nursery catalog, a luxury he had allowed himself with some of the lumberyard income. They would not bear fruit for several years. He understood that he was planting them for the hollow as it would be, not as it was, planting for the future the way a man plants who intends to be there for it. Clem was 12 in 1883 and had been working alongside Emmett in the lumberyard on Saturdays for 2 years, tallying and stacking and learning the grades of lumber with the focused attention he brought to everything. He had Emmett's precision and his mother's directness and his father Thomas's earnestness, and the combination produced a young person of unusual capability. He had also, quietly and without announcement, started calling Emmett Pa sometime in his 9th year, a transition so natural that Emmett had not marked the exact moment it had happened, only noticed one day that it had been true for some time. One evening in the fall of 1883, when Stella and Emmett were sitting by the stove after the children were in bed and the hollow was quiet under its autumn sky, she said, "I think about the morning you rode in sometimes." He looked at her. She was in her chair with her knitting, which had been set down, and she was looking at the stove with the expression of a person revisiting something. "With the writ," he said. "With the writ," she said. "You were going to take the wagon." "I was going to take the wagon," he said, "and then you did not." "No, and then you came back with lumber and men and money you could not afford," she said, "and I thought you must be either the kindest man I had ever met or the most foolish." "What was your conclusion?" he said. She looked at him, and in her eyes was the full warmth that he had been receiving for 5 years and that still had the power to reorganize him. "The kindest," she said. Obviously. He reached over from his chair and took her hand. She turned it and held his in return, and the stove gave it steady heat, and outside the apple trees were small in the dark, growing toward their future. "I should tell you," he said, "that I did not go back to Caldwell and come back with lumber because I am kind." She looked at him. "Then why?" "Because I could not stop thinking about you," he said plainly. "I rode back to Caldwell thinking about a woman hanging laundry on a rope in a hollow with the straightest back I had ever seen, and I could not find a way to justify having taken her home." She was quiet a moment. Then, "You fell in love with me before you came back." "I think I started to," he said honestly. "In the 30 seconds between when you turned around and when you said you are from the bank without any flinching. Yes." She shook her head slightly, but the smile was there, the full one, the one that still reorganized him. "Emmett Ashford," she said. "Stella Ashford," he said. She squeezed his hand and went back to her knitting, and he went back to his own thoughts, which were good ones, which they almost always were now when he was in this house, this hollow, this life. In the years that followed, the apple trees grew. By 1887, the first year the trees bore fruit, Clem was 16 and had begun an apprenticeship at the lumberyard in earnest, with a view to joining the business in time. Ada was 14 and formidably intelligent, reading everything she could obtain and corresponding with a school in Wichita that offered instruction to young women of promising aptitude, which the principal of the Caldwell School, a progressive woman named Miss Alvarez, had encouraged her toward with genuine enthusiasm. Thomas James, 7, was pure prairie energy, a boy who seemed to contain within himself the weather of the open land, changeable and vital and occasionally requiring a fence. Louise, 4, was still the amiable round creature she had been at birth, philosophical about most things and deeply attached to the barn cat, a gray animal named General II, who had taken up residence with the resigned dignity of a cat who has decided these humans will do. On the day the apple trees first bore fruit, in the September of 1887, Stella stood under the nearest tree and reached up and picked the first apple and looked at it in her hand. It was small and imperfect and entirely red, the color of the barn in the evening sun. She took a bite and considered. "Well," Emmett said, watching her from a few feet away. "Sweet," she said. She held it out to him. He took a bite. He had tasted worse apples. He had never tasted one that mattered more. Clem came running from the direction of the barn, with Thomas James riding on his back, with the enthusiasm of a small person for whom a piggyback is always an option. And Ada came from the house with Louise on her hip. And they all stood under the apple tree in the September light, and ate the small, imperfect apples with the satisfaction of people for whom the sweetness of a thing is inseparable from the work that grew it. Stella looked at Emmett over the heads of the children, and in her eyes was the fullness of it. The 5 years of the homestead, the house that had been built in 3 days and expanded over a decade, the spring that Thomas had found and Emmett had cleared, the south-facing window and the west-facing window and the kitchen garden and the red barn and the chickens and the cows and these 4 children in the September grass, and the apple trees bearing fruit for the first time, 9 years after the seed. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He looked back at her and the look was complete, the way their best silences were complete. 2 people who know each other fully, who have worked and grieved and built and laughed and argued and held each other through hard winters and celebrated soft springs, and who find, after all of it, that they are more interested in each other than in anything else the world offers. He reached across and tucked a strand of her dark hair, graying slightly now at the temple in a way he found beautiful, behind her ear. She caught his hand and held it briefly against her cheek. Louise said apple and pointed at the tree, because she was 4 and her requirements were simpler, and Clem lifted her to reach a low branch, and she pulled an apple the size of her fist with triumphant effort and held it above her head like a flag. The hollow around them was October quiet and very wide, the prairie running out in every direction from the ridge, and the cottonwood at the entrance standing in its permanent arch, as it had stood since before Emmett Ashford had ever ridden through it with a writ in his saddlebag, and found a woman he was not prepared for, living in a wagon that was her home. He had left and come back with lumber. He had come back every time after that. He intended to go on coming back to this hollow, to this house, to this woman and these children and this life they had built together from the particular combination of necessity and courage and love that the frontier asked of people, and that these 2 people had between them in full measure. The apple trees would grow taller. The children would grow and go and come back, as children do. The land would stay because land does. The house would stand because it had been built to stand. The spring would run clean on the ridge, as it had run since before any of them were there. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were quiet and the stove was warm, and the Kansas sky was doing its extravagant best with the sunset through the west-facing window, Emmett Ashford and Stella Ashford would sit in their house in their hollow and be exactly where they had intended to be, which was together, which was home, which was everything.